Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question which I will flip in here. And he's basically asking about varying exercise order, and he wants to know, hey, I've noticed you tend to do the same order on your exercises. Shouldn't you vary it a bit so that certain muscles get better activation, meaning the exercises you do earlier in a workout you'll get more benefit from because they're fresh? And couldn't you get better overall development if you rotate through the order you do your exercises in? So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. The thing is with varying exercise order, yes, the order you do exercises in can modestly affect certain things. Meaning the first exercise you do in the day, you can probably put more focus in, but unless you have a reason to do otherwise, and people will note I don't actually follow this rule myself, because I have a reason to do otherwise. But unless you have a reason to do otherwise, when you are pursuing overall development, you should generally do exercises in the order of the biggest muscles working towards the smallest. In other words, training your bigger muscles first doesn't really inhibit your ability to exert yourself on smaller muscles, and particularly if they get used in a lot of the same exercises. A perfect example would be bench pressing and then doing overhead pressing afterwards. Why would you almost always want to do it that way? Because you get less chest involvement in the others. And here's the thing. Doing extra exercises for a given muscle group, you don't have to have the same performance as if they're fresh. And the reason for that, those muscles are still getting stimulus. You're just adding more fatigue from the workout. That would basically be like saying, you shouldn't do ladder sets, multiple sets of an exercise because the first ones wear you out. Well, it's the cumulative fatigue that adds up, and the overhead pressing could still continue to add additional stimulation to your upper chest, your deltoids, your triceps, things like that, even though it might be fatigued from doing bench pressing. Now, there's certainly something to be said for hammering really hard on a specific exercise in a session, meaning having sessions where you might focus more on one versus the other, but for most lifters you may not need to do that, particularly early on in your training. But generally speaking, if your goal is to gain maximum muscle mass or maximum strength, or both, which is often the goal for many people, right, because there's a synergy between the two, then usually you want to do the biggest exercises to the smallest. The biggest exceptions tends to be for sport-specific reasons or weak point development. In my case, my deadlift is a relative strong point. I can rep out over 500 pounds beltless, strapless as a 40-year-old man. I'm not shabby on the deadlift. If you guys calculated my max, I think you'd get a pretty good idea from looking at my rep work these days. I'm not shabby on the deadlift. By comparison, look at my overhead pressing strength. My overhead pressing strength's okay. It's okay. It's not quite on par with, say, my deadlift. A lot of it has to do with my long arms. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm built to deadlift better than I am to overhead press. But that being said, we know other YouTubers than me who aren't quite as strong as me on some lifts, who maybe aren't even quite as big as me, who can overhead press a little more than I can. I can think of some. I'm not going to get into names, but if I recall, maybe Matt Ogus might be an example. Very strong on the overhead press. So when we start looking at proportionate lifts, it's a weak point for me. And I realize that my overall shoulder width, my shoulders themselves, I don't mean my back width and all of that because I'm a wide guy. But my delts themselves, my shoulder girdle has been needing to come up a little bit. My triceps need to come up a little bit. So because I've been trying to bring those things up a little bit this year, I tend to overhead press first in every single workout. Why? Because it's a weak point. It's a weak point. Furthermore, because it's not really fatiguing some of the other muscles I need for other big lifts, it's not a big deal. It actually is reasonably common to see people overhead press before they deadlift in a lot of strength programs. And the reason for that being that a lot of the same stabilizers get used, but they don't get worked as hard on the overhead press. So therefore, you don't lose much performance on the deadlift when you get to it. Also in my case, I don't mind doing it that way because I come from a powerlifting background originally. A lot of powerlifters, and at least myself and a lot of people whose ideas I ascribe to, don't deadlift fresh. Why? This is something we saw a few years back. Remember when Brandon Campbell over at Brandon Campbell Fitness jumped into his first powerlifting meet? You guys remember that? He couldn't nail his gym lifts on the deadlift. And it was kind of a surprise to him, but he had individual deadlift days, didn't he? In other words, he could come in fresh and deadlift a certain weight. By the time he got to meets, he couldn't lift anywhere near what he lifted in the gym. He was like, I hit squats and benches better than I hit in my training when I was psyched up and ready to go, right? And then I get to my deadlift, and what happened? I can't even hit my gym lifts. Why? Because he was used to deadlifting fresh. It's one of the things I tell people as power lifters, you probably want a squat or press of some type before you deadlift if you're going to go power lift. Now, I'm not powerlifting these days, but I have that sort of background. There's a sport-specific application to that. A power lifter is not going to be fresh when he deadlifts. He's not. He's going to have done 6 other lifts. He's going to have hit 6 singles already on 2 other exercises before he gets to deadlifting competition. So he doesn't get to deadlift fresh. He's always going to be fatigued when he gets to deadlift. So if you're going to be a power lifter, it makes sense to train the way you'll compete, in the sense of, if you know you're going to have a certain type of fatigue in any sport you do, when you get to a certain type of event or situation, you need to be able to perform whatever that action happens to be while having a certain type of fatigue like you're going to have in competition. If you don't train that way, you're not going to have a real assessment of what you're capable of doing. And so because I come from that type of background, and I've generally always done other lifts before I deadlift, particularly before a heavy deadlift or any sort of real effort other than like speed training or something, I'm just used to doing that. Because of that sport-specific background, it's not really a big deal to me to come in and do a press or something. Because I do care about my deadlift, though, more than I care about, say, my front squats. I mean, I want my front squats to come up, but right now they're an accessory exercise for me. I front squat after I deadlift, just like I row after I deadlift. I'm prioritizing my lifts in order of their importance to me personally. For me right now, improving overhead pressing over time as I get leaner and cut is important to me. My deadlift is my secondary important, but I would say probably 50% of my gym training or more involves an overhead press of some type. Well, at least half of it on my weekly training workloads involves some sort of overhead press. It's the way I train these days. Because it's a priority for me. I know that's what I need for my performance, for my muscular development, things like that, as I get stronger and stronger on overhead pressing. It's something I really want to improve on, so therefore I'm focusing on it. And that's what it comes down to. When you have exercises that you are adamant about, either for sport-specific reasons, for muscular development reasons, that you are willing to suffer in terms of overall development, to bring up those weak points, it makes sense to train them first, right? It makes sense to train them first because that's the best way to prioritize. Because ultimately, that's the way it's going to work. And usually, you wouldn't do that if the other exercise is a bigger exercise. Normally, you should work the biggest muscles to the smallest. In other words, you should be squatting and deadlifting before you press. Definitely should be doing all your rowing and other things before you try to do biceps. You should probably finish all your pressing before you do a tricep extension, all your pressing before you do a lateral raise for your delts. In other words, you train biggest to smallest because that's usually going to give you the best performance overall, meaning working some of those small muscles first could interfere with you being able to properly overload the bigger muscles on a big exercise, because something that's required for support or one of the primary movers is fatigued, and therefore it becomes a weak link on a big lift. And therefore you get less muscular development from it. But when you have a certain situation to where you're happy with your overall development in most places, and you need to prioritize for, again, either a sport-specific reason, an aesthetic reason, whatever it happens to be, it makes sense to do that exercise first. Also, it makes sense to do more training with that exercise. Again, if you want to get better at something, you need to do it more often. You need to do it more with more volume. You need to dedicate more time, more effort, more energy into it. And if it's something else you're not trying to get good at as fast, it can take a lower priority. And that's what it comes down to. But unless you have a weakness or a priority that you absolutely need to address, you should usually train, particularly for muscle growth. When you're trying to gain muscle mass rapidly, you really should train the biggest muscle to the smallest. Again, the only exception to that becomes when you are trying to prioritize to some extent, and then it makes sense to reverse it. But as far as doing it randomly, you should never ever randomly vary it. That's kind of the question that people also bring up: is should you vary exercises to shock the body? No, that's not how the body works. It's not a good idea. That sort of approach of randomly rotating it in that manner is a good way to gain less muscle. It's a good way to ensure that you gain a little less muscle than you could. Probably not the best approach. Varying exercise order needs to be done with purpose and intent and a specific reason why you're doing it. Because if you do so, when you start breaking away from what I described, there is sometimes a sacrifice to be made, meaning you can lose something for it, and that something is overall development. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.